Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the Making AI Generative for Higher Education project that we led at Ithaka S+R and working with a cohort of universities in the US and Canada. I'll give an overview of what the project was and then some of the highlights from the research we did together. I co-led this project with my colleague Dylan Rudiger at Ithaka S+R. So starting with an overview of what the project was, our project entitled Making AI Generative for Higher Education looked at the core question of how generative AI is affecting teaching, learning, and research missions of higher education institutions. Our goal was to create a collaborative forum and gather actionable evidence to help universities make decisions about generative AI in teaching, learning, and research contexts. This project kicked off in the fall of 2023 and is concluding this summer. This project was done in collaboration with a number of universities. These are the universities that contributed to the research, to the interviews, which I will say more about in a moment. As you can see, it's a variety of university types in the US and Canada. And how this worked is that each university had a team that was working with us. That team usually was made up of individuals from different units, often libraries and centers for teaching and learning, but we also had folks from IT, student success or student affairs, faculty as well. So the first year of our project really focused on surveying the generative AI and higher ed landscape and doing some data collection. Um, so each team that participated did some sort of early assessment of AI perceptions and readiness at their institutions. Often this was focus groups, town halls, surveys, or just informal conversations with department chairs just to get an idea of the landscape and how people were feeling. This was preparatory work for the semi-structured interviews we conducted in the spring of 2024. So each team interviewed a handful of faculty and others who have both teaching and research responsibilities. And I'll go more into that in a moment. Each school did about 12 to 13 interviews. Another thing we did in the first year was we created the generative AI product tracker, which lists products that are available for the higher ed market right now. And if you search for Ithaka S+R's generative AI product tracker, you can easily find it, which we still maintain today. The second year after that initial data collection was more about analyzing what we had learned and implementing initiatives or supporting the institutions in our cohort as they implemented initiatives. So we analyzed the interview findings and published the report this past spring, which is what I'll be saying more about in the second part of this presentation. We also led workshops with our participants informed by design thinking, where we tried to envision what users at our at academic institutions, such as students and instructors, need when it comes to generative AI related support and how to meet those needs. Then also we had all of our participants share AI related initiatives that they're involved with at their institution. These were things like workshops they're running on AI literacy, tools that they may have been, that their institution may have licensed and how the rollout is going, conferences they organized, and also talked about what kinds of challenges remain. So that's how the project worked overall. And now what I'll go into are highlights from the research findings from those interviews that everyone conducted. And this is really going to be a very big picture overview for the sake of time. It won't be able to go into much detail, but the full detail of our findings is available on our website, the Making AI Generative for Higher Ed report under the Publications tab. So a little bit on the research and analysis process. Collectively, with all the institutions and teams that were involved, we conducted 246 semi-structured interviews. Those interviews, as I said before, were with mostly with faculty, some postdocs and grad students, and the criteria was that we were interviewing people who had both teaching and research responsibilities because the interview questions talked about both. Um, there are a wide range of disciplines represented across arts and sciences, law schools, business schools, medical schools. And the questions in the interview guide really focused on both experiences and challenges when it came to navigating AI in teaching, learning, and research contexts. One of the main trends we saw, whether it was in the context of research or in the context of teaching and learning, is that use was generally of generative AI was generally limited and experimental in nature versus actually having identified longer term ways to integrate generative AI into teaching, learning, and research. We should be clear here that we were talking specifically in the interviews about generative AI, not other forms of AI, where researchers may have had already made more headway in integrating that into their research workflows. When it came to instructors, their adoption was often driven by a sense of inevitability and a desire to serve students for their future careers. Um, Especially in sort of profession-oriented fields, instructors often said they really felt like their students would need to have familiarity with generative AI to make themselves as hireable as possible in the current job market, and so felt a sense of mission to incorporate generative AI into their classes to help students. Um, there was a lot of excitement when it came to perceptions, but also it was tempered by an awareness of the risks and limitations of generative AI, of which interviewees on the whole were very highly aware of. When it came to the teaching and learning context, figuring out the relationship between generative AI and learning objectives in the classroom was one of the big unanswered questions, which then sort of related to the question of how to assess students in the age of generative AI, because of course you're trying to assess students based on the learning objectives. A lot of the interviewees were sort of mulling over the same kinds of questions, which is even if they were open to integrating AI, they were asking, how can I integrate AI in a way that actually furthers student learning? Do I need to change the methodology through which I expect my students to learn? And do I need to change my learning objectives in light of generative AI's existence? Should students be learning something different than they were before? Or should I still be trying to teach them the same thing, but how can I use generative AI to help them learn those things? These were some of the questions they didn't really have answers to yet. When it came to integrating generative AI into the classroom in some way or another, which most had experimented with doing, the most common way by far in which they had done that was these sorts of activities that were really geared towards improving AI literacy, by which I mean doing an activity along the lines of having your students use AI for a classroom activity, bring in that conversation with the chatbot, analyze it as a class, and understand thereby generative AI's strengths and weaknesses, and thus make the students more responsible users. One of the main concerns that instructors um, expressed in the interviews that they didn't really trust their students to use AI responsibly. As a result, um, possible ways of using AI, like personalized tutoring, were not very popular among the instructors yet because they didn't quite have that trust in students to use AI responsibly. However, these sorts of AI literacy oriented activities, although instructors were finding them to be very productive, were often presented as sort of temporary, sometimes one-off sorts of activities. The question of how generative AI would really fit into what they were trying to teach in the long run was still unclear. So, on policy and academic integrity, the question of student academic integrity was still a concern, though perhaps not with the panic of when ChatGPT was first released commercially. Most um, instructors had really bought into the discourse that they knew they could not police this tool effectively, What they wanted to do was build trust with their students in terms of what the acceptable uses were. In practice, they reported mixed success. Some were still really holding on to that idea, and others were saying it works with many students, but I'm still catching students who are using it in ways I find inappropriate. Something instructors did also point out, though, is that a lot of the inappropriate or misuses, what they determined to be misuses of AI, they thought were because students were simply confused by the variance in AI policies, that what was a misuse in their classroom was not a misuse in someone else's classroom, which could just depend on the instructor or on the discipline. And there was a strong desire among instructors to have more coherence across policies. At the same time, they somewhat self-contradicted themselves in saying that they did feel that different disciplines were going to have different norms for how generative AI should be used, and that was inevitable. Another major issue for instructors was that they felt that AI literacy had not been formally integrated well enough into student learning or student curricula at that point. There has been a lot of headway on this in many schools since the time of our interviews, so this may be less of a slightly less of a concern, if though still a concern than it was at the time we spoke to people. And something that was tricky was that there wasn't much consensus among the interviewees of who they thought should be coordinating these initiatives around AI literacy. Then we also asked instructors how they themselves were using generative AI, not just in the context of student learning, but actually for teaching tasks. And most of the use was somewhat experimental and limited. Many had not actually tried this out yet, but those who had experimented with using AI to help with teaching workflows, the most common way they had done that was just by generating course materials, which is activities for the students, problem sets, rubrics. Some used it to sort of take their notes and turn it into something more coherent to give us student feedback, and others just for brainstorming teaching ideas. When it came to research, the most common uses reported were at the beginning or the end of the research or writing process, which is to say brainstorming and ideating, or revising writing. Other uses came up too. The most popular after those first two was coding, especially in fields where that was relevant. Though even for some fields in which coding may not be as mainstream, interviews reported that generative AI was lowering the barrier to being able to code and incorporate that into their work. Also, summarization and lit review were quite popular, even if somewhat contentious, as some felt that it was still important to really read an article oneself and not rely on an AI summary to do good research. Other uses included data processing and analysis, even small things like generating titles or brainstorming title ideas, and in some case, search and discovery, though with mixed results in terms of accuracy. There are a number of barriers that interviewees felt that kept them from further adopting AI in research in certain contexts. Um, Although I will say that among researchers in general, there was a strong sense of excitement about what it could do for the field, um, even if there was caution around AI's risks. The main concern was around accuracy and reliability, that researchers still felt a strong desire to have high quality research and were cautious about how they were using AI. For some folks, there was a fear about a sense of inauthenticity, or as one person put it, the outsourcing of creative or intellectual labor by using AI. For some people, it's just the learning curve, and this was actually a case in both the research and teaching that they just felt they hadn't really mastered the technology well enough to properly apply it. In a few specific cases, researchers said they just didn't see generative AI tools yet as helping with their research, or at least certain parts of their research, like those who are working on in art non-digitized archives. And also, many interviewees felt that AI wasn't necessarily best at making judgment calls about what knowledge was worth pursuing. That perhaps it could help solve a problem, but if you were showed it a number of problems, it couldn't actually identify which was the most important or interesting or worth pursuing. Also, researchers felt that there's a general lack of clarity in their field and in academia in general around research integrity, ethics, and best practices when it came to generative AI, and they were hoping for more guidance from within their disciplines, from journals, etc. Finally, we did also ask interviewees about support resources that they were using and ones that they would like to see more of. The two things that they really were leaning on and also wanted to see more of were sort of discipline-specific training or resources and opportunities to learn from their peers. Peers were really seen as the trusted source of information. That if a peer, especially one in your discipline, could give you a concrete example of how they had applied generative AI in either a teaching context or a research context, the interviewees seemed more likely to more or less take or copy and paste with some slight modifications that concrete example into their own work. And they felt this really helped with the learning curve. Others were interested in equitable access to tools, opportunities for hands-on experimentation. Some really wanted to see their institutions invest more in computing infrastructure. And finally, it's worth mentioning that the range of products mentioned by interviewees was very narrow. The main product mentioned was ChatGPT. And in many cases, based on interviewees' comments, it seemed that they had not been able to find the right tool for their needs, suggesting that a better knowledge of the very vast product landscape that's available for higher education could be useful for many. We also asked where they would like to find support and resources, and there was really no preference. Um, Many actually at this point had not been using university provided resources, but actually had just been really searching the internet on their own and following a sort of self-education. Our report concludes with recommendations. This slide can't hold all of them, so you'll have to see the full report for the detailed ones. And here I just summarized a few um, key ones. And these are really just ideas that came directly out of what we heard in the interviews and maybe things that institutions might want to think further about in the upcoming months. What to consider whether they feel they've already done this or could do it better or might want to do some version of this. So one thing would be articulating a strategic vision for AI at an institutional level, coordinating those key initiatives at institutions like AI literacy and data security awareness, um, incentivizing support structures or resources that are happening not just institution-wide, but also more geared towards disciplines, perhaps on the levels of schools or departments. Identifying heavy users among faculty and giving them platforms to share best practices. This really comes out of the very consistent desire we heard from interviewees to be able to learn from their peers. But sometimes it could be hard to find who were those peers who had the right knowledge. Also, another thing we gathered from the interviews is that some instructors were very enthusiastic and others were very resistant. Really, perceptions and feelings about AI were completely across the board. And something that we put in the recommendations is that perhaps rather than following a discourse about AI that either that really, really promotes it or really, really doesn't, is emphasizing the importance of literacy, that whether you really want to adopt it or not, understanding it and how it works and becoming AI literate is really important for you and your students, and that this kind of literacy approach would continue to encourage critical reflection and intentional pedagogy, taking the time to think about where and how and if AI should be integrated. And this final point is really along the same lines, which is encouraging scholarship on teaching and learning in the context of AI. Again, that sort of critical reflection and intentional pedagogy, and using that to help sort of create institution-specific data for decision making. And with that, I'll conclude. My contact information is here, and the full report is on our website. Thank you so much.